This photograph was taken in the Belgian Congo in 1930. A white man in safari clothing stands beside two indigenous pygmy hunters. Between them hangs the massive body of a dead mountain gorilla, strung up like a trophy. The gorilla's arms are stretched wide, its face frozen in death. The white man is Attilio Gatti, an Italian explorer and filmmaker. The caption calls the two African men hired pygmies, and this single photograph captures everything that was wrong with colonialism in Africa. The great white explorer, Attilio Gatti, was born in Italy in 1896. By the 1920s, he had reinvented himself as a professional adventurer. He led expeditions into Central Africa, made films, wrote books, and gave lectures to packed audiences in Europe and America. Gatti presented himself as a brave explorer venturing into the unknown, bringing civilization and knowledge to the dark continent. His audiences loved it. They paid good money to hear stories of dangerous animals, exotic landscapes, and primitive tribes. But Gatti wasn't discovering anything. The places he explored had been inhabited for thousands of years. The animals he hunted were well known to local people. He was simply exploiting Africa for profit and fame. The hired workers. Look at the two African men in the photograph. The caption calls them hired pygmies, as if they were employees in a normal business arrangement. They weren't. In 1930, the Belgian Congo was one of the most brutally exploited colonies in the world. For decades, indigenous people had been subjected to forced labor, violence, and economic extraction under Belgian rule. The term pygmy itself is colonial language, a catch-all used for several distinct ethnic groups in Central Africa, each with their own culture, language, and identity. These men weren't Gatti's willing employees. In the colonial system, indigenous people had little choice but to work for Europeans. Refusing could mean violence, imprisonment, or starvation. Notice what they're holding. Traditional spears. These men were skilled hunters. They knew the forest intimately. They tracked the gorilla. They killed it. They carried it back. Their knowledge and labor made Gatti's expedition possible. But in the photograph, they're nameless. Anonymous. Props in the white man's adventure story. Gatti got the glory. They got nothing. The dead gorilla mountain gorillas were already rare in 1930. They lived only in the dense forests of Central Africa, the same forests being rapidly destroyed by colonial logging and plantation agriculture. To European trophy hunters like Gatti, gorillas represented the ultimate prize. Massive, powerful, dangerous. Killing one proved your courage and masculinity. But gorillas aren't aggressive. They're gentle herbivores that live in peaceful family groups. They only attack when threatened, when defending their young. The gorilla in this photograph was probably killed while trying to protect its family. Look at how it's displayed. Strung up on poles, arms spread wide to emphasize its size. This wasn't subsistence hunting. This wasn't killing for food or community protection. This was killing for sport, for prestige, for a photograph to show back home. The indigenous hunters who actually killed this animal understood the forest ecosystem. They knew which animals could be hunted sustainably. But they were working under Gatti's orders, hunting to satisfy European desires, not community needs. What the photograph really shows, this image captures the essence of colonialism in a single frame. A well-dressed white man stands at the center, comfortable in control, the star of his own adventure story. Two African men stand beside him, skilled, essential, but nameless, reduced to a racial category, pygmies. And between them hangs a dead animal, a magnificent creature killed not for survival but for entertainment. The photograph was meant to celebrate Gatti's achievement, his bravery, his conquest of wild Africa. But what it actually shows is exploitation of people, of animals, of an entire continent treated as a playground for wealthy Europeans. The Belgian Congo, by 1930, the Belgian Congo had been under European control for nearly 50 years. What happened there was one of the worst atrocities in colonial history. King Leopold II of Belgium had claimed the territory as his personal property in 1885. Millions of Congolese people died through violence, forced labor, disease, and famine. Hands were cut off as punishment for failing to meet rubber quotas. Villages were burned. Families destroyed. Even after the Belgian government took control in 1908, exploitation continued. The colony existed to extract resources: rubber, ivory, minerals, animal products, for Belgian profit. Indigenous people were forced to work in mines, on plantations, as porters for European expeditions. They had no rights, no protection, no voice. When Gaddy hired local people for his expeditions, he was participating in this system of exploitation. The aftermath, Attilio Gaddy went on to have a successful career. He became famous. He made money. He was celebrated as a great explorer. The two men in this photograph, we don't know their names. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know if they survived the colonial period, if they had families, if they lived to see their country gain independence in 1960. The mountain gorillas, they came close to extinction. Trophy hunting, habitat destruction, and poaching nearly wiped them out. Today, only about 1,000 mountain gorillas remain in the wild. They're critically endangered. What this photograph teaches us. When you look at this image, remember what it really represents. It's not a triumph of human courage over nature. It's not a celebration of exploration and discovery. It's a document of colonial exploitation. A reminder that European adventure in Africa came at a terrible cost, paid by indigenous people and the natural world. The two men in this photograph deserved better than to be called hired pygmies in a caption. They deserved to be named, to be recognized, to have their skills and knowledge valued. The gorilla deserved to live, to raise its young, to exist in peace in its forest home. And the continent of Africa deserved better than to be treated as a resource to be extracted, an adventure playground for wealthy foreigners. This photograph is from 1930, but its lessons remain relevant today. When we see images of white tourists posing with dead animals in Africa, we're seeing the same colonial mindset. When we hear indigenous people described as primitive or tribal, we're hearing the same colonial language. When we treat nature as something to be conquered rather than protected, we're repeating the same colonial mistakes. The photograph of Attilio Gaddy and his hired pygmies with a dead gorilla isn't just history. It's a warning about the consequences of exploitation, the price of treating people and nature as resources to be used and discarded. We need to remember that warning, because the mentality that created this photograph hasn't disappeared. It's just taken new forms. And until we truly reckon with that history, we'll keep repeating it. The execution. Billy the Elephant, Los Angeles Zoo, 1939. This photograph was taken at the Los Angeles Zoo in 1939. Two men stand in a dirt enclosure, aiming rifles at an elephant. The elephant was Billy. He had lived at the zoo for years, and now, zoo staff had decided he had to die. The official reason: Billy had become uncontrollable. Old elephants can be dangerous. They said they were protecting themselves. But this photograph tells a darker story about how we treat animals we claim to care for, about what happens when captivity breaks a wild creature's spirit, and about the casual cruelty hiding behind the word necessary. Billy's life in captivity. Billy was an Asian elephant, captured as a young animal and brought to the United States to live in captivity. He spent years at the Los Angeles Zoo, on display for visitors who came to see exotic animals. His enclosure was small, a dirt yard with some trees, maybe a pool of water, nothing like the miles of forest and grassland that wild elephants roam. No herd, no family structure, no natural social bonds. Elephants are among the most intelligent animals on Earth. They have complex emotions, strong family bonds, long memories. They can recognize themselves in mirrors, mourn their dead, show compassion to other species. In the wild, elephants live in matriarchal family groups. Young elephants learn from their elders. They play, they communicate through infrasound calls that travel for miles. They care for each other's young. Billy had none of that. He lived alone, in a barren enclosure, performing the same behaviors day after day for human entertainment. And as he aged, something changed. The problem with old elephants: the caption says Billy had become uncontrollable. What does that mean? In captivity, elephants can develop something called must, a periodic condition in male elephants where testosterone levels spike dramatically. During must, elephants become aggressive, unpredictable, difficult to manage. But must is a natural biological state. In the wild, it's part of the elephant's reproductive cycle. Other elephants understand it and know how to respond. In captivity, isolated from other elephants, must becomes a crisis. There's no herd to provide social structure, no space to move away, no natural outlet for the elephant's instincts. Zookeepers in the early 20th century had crude methods for controlling elephants. Chains, bullhooks, punishment. When those methods stopped working, when an elephant became too large or too aggressive to control through force, zoos faced a choice. They could try to transfer the elephant to a larger facility with better conditions. They could invest in proper training and enrichment. They could recognize that the problem wasn't the elephant. It was captivity itself. Or they could do what the Los Angeles Zoo did to Billy: execute him. The decision to kill. Look at the photograph. Two men with rifles, standing in broad daylight, preparing to shoot an elephant at close range. This wasn't an emergency. This wasn't a dangerous animal that had escaped and threatened public safety. This was a controlled execution, planned in advance, carried out methodically. The zoo staff decided Billy had passed his expiration date, a phrase typically used for products for things we consume and discard. That's what Billy had become, a product that was no longer useful. He'd entertained visitors for years, but now he was too difficult to manage, too expensive to care for, too dangerous to keep. So they killed him. They could have tried other options. Even in 1939, there were sanctuaries, other facilities, ways to handle elephants humanely. But those options required effort, money, compassion. It was easier to just shoot him. The method. The photograph shows the moment before Billy's death. The men are aiming their rifles at his head, probably targeting the brain to ensure a quick death. But shooting an elephant is not simple or humane. An elephant's skull is incredibly thick. The brain is relatively small compared to the massive head. A misplaced shot means suffering. An elephant screaming in pain, bleeding, dying slowly. We don't know if he suffered. We don't know if he understood what was happening, if he was afraid, if he tried to escape, or simply stood there, broken by years of captivity. What we do know is that this was presented as a practical, necessary decision. Old elephants can become uncontrollable. Problem solved. No acknowledgement that humans created the problem by capturing a wild animal and forcing it to live in conditions that drove it to aggression. No recognition that Billy deserved better. No shame. The casual cruelty of early zoos. In the early 20th century, zoos were very different from today. They weren't focused on conservation or education. They were entertainment venues, spectacles of exotic animals displayed for human amusement. Animals lived in concrete cages, often alone, with no enrichment, no attempt to replicate natural habitats. When animals died, from disease, from stress, from despair, they were simply replaced. Elephants were particularly vulnerable. They're difficult to care for properly, even under the best conditions. In the crude facilities of early zoos, elephants suffered enormously. Many developed stereotypic behaviors, repetitive, purposeless movements like swaying, pacing, head bobbing. These behaviors indicate severe psychological distress. Some elephants simply gave up. They stopped eating, stopped responding to stimuli, wasted away, and died. Others, like Billy, became aggressive. And when captive elephants fought back against their conditions, humans called them uncontrollable and killed them. What's changed and what hasn't? Today's accredited zoos are supposed to be different. They emphasize conservation, education, and animal welfare. Many have stopped keeping elephants entirely, recognizing that proper elephant care requires resources most zoos don't have. But problems persist. Elephants still die prematurely in captivity. They still develop psychological problems. They still suffer in inadequate enclosures. And when captive elephants become difficult to manage, facilities still face the same choice: invest in proper care or get rid of the problem. Most zoos no longer execute animals publicly, but they euthanize them for medical reasons or transfer them to facilities with questionable standards. The language has changed, but the underlying issue remains. The question we should ask: when you look at this photograph of Billy facing execution, ask yourself, who decided this elephant should be taken from the wild? Who profited from his captivity? Who made the choice to kill him rather than care for him properly? The answer is always the same: humans. We captured Billy. We imprisoned him. We drove him to aggression through isolation and inadequate care. And then we killed him for being uncontrollable. And we took a photograph, as if this was normal, acceptable, even admirable. Look how efficiently we solve problems. Billy's death in 1939 happened because we treated animals as things to be used and discarded. We put entertainment above welfare. We prioritized convenience over compassion. The legacy. This photograph survives as a document of how we treated animals before we knew better. Except we did know better. Even in 1939, people understood that elephants were intelligent, emotional, social creatures. The science of animal behavior was developing. The evidence was there. We just chose to ignore it, because acknowledging elephant sentience would have required treating them differently. And that would have been expensive, inconvenient, unprofitable. So Billy died, shot in his enclosure at the Los Angeles Zoo, because he had outlived his usefulness. His story isn't unique. Thousands of elephants died in captivity in the 20th century. Many were killed for the same reason. They became too difficult to manage. The photograph of Billy's execution is a reminder that our relationship with animals is built on exploitation. We take them from the wild, we use them for entertainment or profit, and when they're no longer useful, we dispose of them. We tell ourselves it's necessary. We call it humane. We create systems and policies that make it seem reasonable. But look at that photograph again. Really look at it. Two men with rifles. An elephant who spent his life in captivity. A death sentence, carried out because caring properly for this animal was too inconvenient. That's not humane. That's not necessary. That's cruelty, disguised as practicality. The uncomfortable truth. The story of Billy the elephant forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The institutions we trust to care for animals don't always deserve that trust. Zoos, circuses, marine parks, they present themselves as educational, as conservation-minded, as places where animals are loved and protected. But behind the public messaging, animals suffer. They live in inadequate conditions. They develop psychological problems. And when they become difficult to manage, they're disposed of. The photograph of Billy's execution is from 1939. But the mentality that allowed his killing hasn't disappeared. It's just better hidden now. We still capture wild animals and put them in zoos. We still breed animals in captivity who will never see the wild. We still prioritize human entertainment over animal welfare. And when those animals suffer, when they develop problems from living in captivity, we still blame them instead of the system that created their suffering. Billy the elephant deserved better. He deserved to live free in the forests of Asia. He deserved a herd, a family, a life. Instead, he got a dirt enclosure, isolation, and eventually a bullet to the head. That's the truth this photograph reveals. And it's a truth we still need to reckon with today. The Jump, U.S. Army cavalry stunt, early 1900s. This photograph captures a moment of pure confidence bordering on insanity. 5 U.S. Army soldiers sit calmly around a dining table eating their meal. A 6th soldier on horseback is jumping directly over them. Horse and rider suspended in midair, clearing the table by inches. This wasn't an emergency. This wasn't combat. This was entertainment. The cavalry culture. In the early 20th century, the cavalry was the elite branch of the U.S. Army. Soldiers were expected to be expert horsemen, capable of incredible feats. But skill alone wasn't enough. Cavalry culture demanded bravado, showmanship, and risk-taking. Jumping a horse over seated men? That proved you belonged. Look at the soldiers at the table. They're not flinching. They're calmly eating as a 1,200-pound animal soars over their heads. That casualness was the point, demonstrating trust and shared culture. The risk. This stunt was incredibly dangerous. If the horse refused, if it clipped the table, if the rider lost control, people would die. A horse's hoof can crush a skull. The slightest miscalculation would turn this into tragedy. But risk was the appeal. In peacetime, soldiers find ways to prove their courage. Jumping over your comrades at dinner? That qualified. The performance this photograph was staged. The table is positioned perfectly. The photographer is ready. This was planned, rehearsed, executed for the camera to impress civilians and boost recruitment. And it worked. The photograph survives as a testament to cavalry culture, bold, confident, a little crazy. The legacy. Within decades, horse cavalry became obsolete. World War I proved horses couldn't compete with machine guns and tanks. But the culture survived. The emphasis on skill, courage, and controlled risk remained central to military identity. The stunts changed. Paratroopers, fighter pilots, special forces. But the ethos stayed the same. This photograph captures when military prowess meant horsemanship, when skill meant jumping over comrades while they ate dinner. Absurd, dangerous, completely unnecessary. And that's exactly why they did it.